Mark, can you just talk us through the latest data we are seeing on what food flows actually look like, how many people ultimately could be left hungry due to this crisis?
Well, we've at the Centre for Global Development, we have just in the last hour or so published our new data on exactly that question. And it shows a couple of things. Firstly, there are a much larger number of countries really facing a big problem than I think people had appreciated before. Countries in Central America, in the Middle East, in parts of Asia, and in Africa, who are really going to be struggling to finance the additional costs of food imports they need to make because they don't produce enough food domestically. But we're also seeing another big worrying thing happening, which is that as the donor countries, the US and Europe in particular, do what they need to do in bringing relief aid and life-saving help to Ukraine, the way they're doing that to a significant degree is cutting their assistance to other places where people are already on the verge of starvation. So there are tens of millions of people across 10 countries or so who are really imperiled now by this combination of different things going on. Prices higher, unable in their own economies to cope, needing help, and yet that help is being diverted elsewhere.
So, Mark, there's a statement that's just come out from the NATO Secretary General. He's talking about the possible duration of the conflict that we're seeing in Ukraine. Be prepared, he says, for a long haul. This war may last for weeks, but also months and possibly years. If it lasts for years, how quickly can we adapt? How quickly can we change global food flows in order to deal with this crisis and find a way of working around it?
I think the adjustment process is best seen in months rather than weeks, but months rather than years, I think. There will be scope in Europe, in North America, in Argentina and those kind of places to change planting patterns, maybe to switch the use of corn, maize from biofuels into food. There will be an adjustment opportunity. But the question is, how do we get through the rest of this year, in particular protecting those very, very vulnerable people in deeply food insecure countries so that, they basically survive to get the benefit of what should be a successful adjustment, later this year and into 2023.
Well, and I was looking through some of the data. Ukraine annually exports about 40% of its wheat and corn to Africa. So it really goes to show you where some of the pockets concentrated of pain could ultimately be. What is the least appropriate policy response here? What should policymakers avoid doing?
Well, there's a range of things not to do. Export bans typically make things worse. Failing to adjust and adapt. In other words, don't delay bringing in new land for planting. Don't divert aid from very poor countries to Ukraine. You need for a short period to expand your aid programs and be prepared for the long haul is the other part of the message, really for the reasons that Jens Stoltenberg, who you just quoted from NATO, was giving.
What can we do on the logistics front, maybe to allow a more seamless flow of food around the world?
So that's a great question. And of course, what has happened typically is countries and aid agencies rely on particular sources of grain. And a lot of Ukraine's grain and Russia's grain, in fact, has been relied on by the World Food Programme to the UN agency to feed the people in the countries where they work. And they're all going to need to adjust. It will be possible, assuming there's decent harvests in Europe, North America, Argentina, and those kinds of places, to change supply routes, to adjust the shipping system, adjust the role of places where the bankers and insurers play. But the policymakers need to get onto that sooner rather than later if they're going to deal with the real-time problem that hungry people in these countries face right now.
Well, Mark, already farmers across the world, before the war in Ukraine even, were dealing with challenges: higher fertilizer costs, higher labor costs, higher input costs, really across the board. To what extent does the war just exacerbate something that already was going to be a problem? And I guess by extension, if we do, which again, question mark, Jens Stoltenberg says, see a resolution to the conflict sooner rather than later, what kind of spot does that still leave us in?
Well, of course, input prices, whether it's gas or oil or fertilizer, which is based heavily on gas prices, do go up and down historically. It's probably 2008 that was the last time we saw anything like this combination of food, fuel, fertilizer price increases. And then there was an adjustment back down. So these ebbs and flows do happen. The issue really is planning for the current spike realistically, I think, to go on for some time, and adjusting to cope with that, not just over the next few months, but for a longer period. Food prices, for all of us, I think, are likely to be higher for the next years than we've been used to over the last few years.
How much higher? The UN says food prices could rise another 22%. Does that sound about right to you?
I think it's impossible to tell. I mean, you guys on the show look at commodity prices all the time, and one thing we all know is predicting exactly where the oil price or gas price or gold price will go is a mug's game, really. No one really knows, and a lot of it is about sentiment and what markets think. But there are some structural reasons why prices are likely for a while to be elevated. They could come down again over a period of the next few years, say, but you need to adjust in the meantime. Guessing precisely the day-to-day, month-to-month price variation, I think is not the right basis for taking action. You need to have a recognition of how you would cope in a variety of scenarios for how prices evolve.
Mark, clearly hunger has very obvious humanitarian ramifications just from a human standpoint, but what are the broader economic ramifications of people who go hungry, of food insecurity?
So there's different sorts of ramifications. I mean, firstly, there is the impact that undernutrition and not having enough to eat has on the cognitive development, the brain formation, the productivity, the health of people around the planet, especially infants and children. But there's another wider dimension as well, which is the impact of hungry people and how they react on national stability. You know, lots of people point to the last spike period, 2007-8, in the Middle East of food prices as one of the causes of the Arab Spring and all the violence leading to that horrible civil war that we've seen for the last 10 years in Syria, as well as crises in other places. So, you know, these things are destabilizing, and they contribute to the causes of conflict, and those problems are not easily contained. They tend to spread. So there are geopolitical consequences for what we're seeing now in the longer term, as well as the very human ones that you refer to.